Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome again to our beautiful city, which we call the Imaginaries podcast. It is whatever we want it to be, and today it is going to be a city populated by the two of us, your intrepid hosts, and you, who is listening to us, and whoever else is listening to us, even though we don't know who you are, so make yourself known.
Tony.
We want to know who you are. That's all I'm really coming down to.
No, we want you to be a mystery.
Oh, okay. We want you to be a mystery. In our city that is today all about the city. So we have promised in the last few podcasts that we would do a 3-part podcast series about setting in science fiction fantasy. We started with the spaceship. We continued with the space station. Both of those were obviously geared more towards science fiction. But this third one, the city, is going to be shared pretty equally between science fiction and fantasy. And we're going to branch out into a lot of other genres, subgenres, bordering genres as well. So it's going to be really interesting. We're going to talk about a lot of books and a lot of shows and a lot of movies, so please come along with us. Enjoy this city of a podcast. And whatever we talk about, if you're more interested in it, we would certainly recommend you give it a try, give it a look, give it a read, give it a whatever. So without further ado, what are we going to talk about? Besides cities.
As you can tell from my humming, which is totally out of tune and awesome. One of the first and most, memorable cities in the general universe of science fiction and fantasy is the cities, plural, that show up in The Lord of the Rings. It is, in fact, it's a landscape that is populated by cities. That's a really bad metaphor or expression. It is a landscape that is dotted with significant cities, which play significant roles in the plot. And this isn't to say that there aren't more rural settings in Lord of the Rings. Those are significant as well. But when you think of Lord of the Rings and setting, often you're thinking of Minas Tirith, Minas Morgul. You think of Mordor, which is kind of one giant city of orcs, I guess. Edoras for Rohan. I've been Americanized, and all of these cities are kind of social experiments in Lord of the Rings. Each one, in some way, shape, or form, taps into one of Tolkien's favorite old Western European cultures that he studied and was famous for being an expert on, whether it was Welsh or Viking era Danes, or, something along those lines. Like, Edoras and Rohan was very, very much based on Viking culture. Gondor was based more on, old British. And then there were, elements of the Celts in there as well. He wasn't above mixing and matching as he saw fit. But cities played a significant role, not just as, places where things happened, but as also distillations of kinds of people and kinds of dealing with the world, or ways of dealing with the world. So the good people all lived in cities that were built of white stone or wood, natural, in a sense, creations. And evil creatures all lived in cities that were damaged or broken or lit by an eerie light. They were very on the nose about how the physical manifestation of the city reflected the character of the people who inhabited it. And it was somewhat simplistic and somewhat reductive, but in a sense it also really, obviously you can tell it really appeals to people to have patterning like that. People love Lord of the Rings still, and this is 2018, and it was written well over 50 years ago. So I think that is one of the first cities or groupings of cities that we go to, is the kind of example in fantasy, which is Lord of the Rings. Which is not the first fantasy, and it's not the last fantasy to use it, but that sort of trope of the city is very, very clearly marked in Lord of the Rings. But we had a lot of other texts on this list. Did you have one that you kind of would pair against Lord of the Rings, either to contrast or complement it?
Well, I think that the way that, like, Edoras for the Rohan and Minas Tirith for Gondor, like, the way that they function for those lands is that they're almost like city-states. Like, you have the farmers and the herders and the people who are out in the very pastoral landscapes of Middle-earth. But the cities are the centers of society, of culture. They're where the kings are. They're where, like, the people who are well-to-do live. And granted, in Lord of the Rings, especially on screen, and, a little bit less so in the books, just because we get much more, surrounding information. They're constantly under threat, so we're not seeing them at their best, but they are very clearly marked as the most important part of that particular landscape. And I think that kind of trope pairs well with how other fantasies, and I think this is more of a fantasy thing than it is a science fiction thing, with some other cities. For example, in Nnedi Okorafor's Akata series, there are cities that function similar to that, in that they are centers of culture and society, and all the important people, all the important ideas, all the important knowledge is housed there. In Erika Johansson's The Tierling trilogy, New London serves that same role. In the City of Stairs and the books that come after by Robert Jackson Bennett, those cities also play a similar role. And right there in the name, you have City of Stairs for the first book, City of Blades for the second book, so on and so forth. The city is such an integral part of those stories and how they're told that they get actually incorporated into the title. So I think that one of the important city tropes that we're going to encounter is that in which there is one or a few particular cities where everything happens, and it's the seat of everything important for that particular land.
And I love that you brought up Robert Jackson Bennett's City of Stairs and the Divine Cities series as a whole. I've read the first 2 of 3, and I've kind of been holding off on the third one for a rainy day when I'm really feeling miserable, because there's something about that series which works on me in a way that, say, Lord of the Rings doesn't. They have affect. We use this word occasionally on the podcast to kind of indicate when a text moves us on a subconscious or emotional level, in a way that it operates independently of perhaps the plot. It's something that has texture and in a sense it just like it acts on you. It has an affect. And the Divine Cities is a great example of a cityscape that is designed. I mean, each cityscape, because it's a different city in each book, but the cityscape which is designed to make you feel something. The aesthetic of it, the texture of it, the things which happen in it are all geared to create a certain affect. And that differs in, the kind of affect differs from book to book, just as the city differs from book to book. So each city has its own unique character. And I think the best, I say best, the cities in science fiction and fantasy, which I love best, are ones that have distinct affects. And so as an experiment in cities, Robert Jackson Bennett's Divine Cities trilogy is like a real powerhouse for me. I love that series. Yeah.
Agreed. And I think that's that particular trope, that particular, the city with a little flavor, with a character, with its with its own affect, as you say, that's something that's very particular, in fact, maybe even peculiar to those sort of different world high fantasies where, you don't necessarily have a lot of contact with the real world. I think the Akata series, which I mentioned, is an exception to that rule, but that's also one of those books where you have a fully fledged spirit world, and I'm doing it a disservice by not, digging into exactly how Nnedi Okorafor does it. But you basically have 2 different worlds. One that is more the Muggle world, to steal Harry Potter terminology, and one that is more magical, kind of spiritual world. So the spirit world has its own city that is, that way. But if we look back at the Muggle world, there's
mundane.
Mundane. Mundane is a great way to put it. But to use Akata again as an example, as well as Harry Potter, you have this idea where the city can often be really multifaceted. That if you're a character who's kind of in the know, who is magical or possesses abilities or what have you, then you, as that character, look at the city in a completely different way than a muggle or a more mundane person might do it. So when we see, for example, in the Harry Potter series, London through Harry's eyes, we see things like Diagon Alley, we see Platform 9 3/4, we see the Ministry of Magic and Gringotts Bank and everything, that magical people can see. Whereas through Muggle vision, to a Muggle, London is a little more boring. Which is to say, our version of it is a little more boring. And that's enacted in the Akata series as well. So this idea that the city can be multiple things to multiple people is true in any city in real life. But it's exacerbated and really put in stark display in these fantasies that really, that ask you to look at these cities the way that a magical person might.
Well, and we will get to talking about like cities we know being transformed in science fiction and fantasy, but I think it's important to note in the case of Akata, that series and the Harry Potter series as well, that a fundamental aspect of at least one subset of science fiction and fantasy that deals with cities is that it be somewhere else to an American audience specifically. Americans tend to dig into fantasy if it's not set in America. Like that there's some, especially about like YA or junior fiction kind of reading level fantasy. It's almost an imperative that it not be set, say, in a magical version of New York or Chicago. Like when you look at Harry Potter's London, a fundamental appeal to that world is that it's British.
Right.
And a fundamental appeal to Akata for an American audience is that it introduces us to this very real but other, in a sense, world of like Nigerian high fantasy. Yeah. And I think that we would be doing a disservice to the kind of the general description of the power of these books if we didn't mention that they other themselves in order to allow us to find familiarity in these worlds. Yeah. Which I think is a really interesting move. Like, we share a lot we share so much with Sunny in terms of, we bond with her over the course of the book. We bond with Harry over the course of the Harry Potter books. We find ways to be familiar with them. But in order to do that, we have to go somewhere else first. And I would be so, so curious to hear how British people would respond to Harry Potter. I haven't had those conversations with British people. I've had them with Australians and Americans. And I'd be so curious to hear how Nigerians and Nigerian Americans read the Akata series and whether or not that otherness plays a factor for them. Plays a role in how they interpret and receive the book.
Yeah, totally.
And how the city works in that sense.
Yeah. Yes, I agree.
Okay. So we have some other cities to tackle. Did we have another category?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I think that what you just said about alternate versions or visions of cities that we already know, maybe that'll shed some light on this othering of cities, through the magical eye or through the eye of someone who isn't a mundane or a muggle. So let's talk about some alternate visions of cities. So when we're thinking about these, I'm trying to distinguish between a city that we could go to right now, for example, the London of Harry Potter, the Lagos of Akkad Warrior and Akkad Witch, and they're fundamentally different, yet share a name, share features, share certain similarities with the cities that we know. I think the best example here for me is the His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman and the new trilogy, which began with the Book of Dust last year, looking at especially Oxford, but the rest of the British
If you've been
Isles.
to Oxford, they'll be familiar.
Yeah, right. And I think that's the key, that if you've been to Oxford, which I have not, but, you know, there is almost certainly some familiarity there, and yet there's enough unfamiliarity to, like, you know, discompose you in an interesting way. And it's not just, you know, people walking around with their daemons. It's people going to Jordan College. It's where Lyra Belacqua lives. And it's a thing that doesn't exist in the Oxford that we know and has never existed. And that's a way to immediately distinguish that this is not a version of the city that we know. It's enough. It's off just enough.
Right. And in the case of the Book of Dust and the Historic Materials series, I mean, you're getting very close to what I would classify as the subgenre alternate history.
Yeah.
And that is like, we'll get into whole podcasts about alternate history in the future. That's on our, you know, extended list of podcasts to deal with.
Yeah.
But I think it there's a pleasurable blurring between alternate history and near future histories and things like that, where, like, we are creating new histories for these places that we love, whether they're happening simultaneously with our current history, whether they're re-envisionings of our historic past, or whether they're projections into the future, as is the case with New York 2140 by Kim Stanley Robinson, and also The Expanse, which, by the way, I totally imagine those two on the same trajectory. Just like Andy Weir and the creators of The Expanse decided that The Martian and The Expanse exist in the same universe, so too, in my mind, does a lot of Kim Stanley Robinson and The Expanse and The Martian. Like, they all kind of are in the same near future. We're projecting, current science, what we understand of current science, into the near future to decide what this landscape is going to look like. And in the case of New York 2140, that is the plot as well. The reshaping of the land, the reorganization of the city of New York itself as waters rise, and the different economic groups that this makes apparent, the different social groups, the way that the city does and does not come together to deal with climate change. Like, that's the plot. In the case of The Expanse, it's mostly just setting. And it's a really good setting. And actually, I have to say, the extended intro to The Expanse, when they show time lapse of climate change happening to the surface of planet Earth specifically. They show it to the Belt and Mars as well. But there's several close-up shots, like, of the Statue of Liberty being submerged and then unsubmerged, like they evacuate it again afterward and create dikes around it. That, like, 30-second total time lapse of all of New York changing over time is really emotionally powerful, and part of it's the music. I'd be lying if it wasn't the music too. And part of it is the scope and the scale of the whole thing. But you can tell, looking at these snapshots in The Expanse, that they've really thought through, like, what the historic past of the setting of New York specifically is, and also some of the other places around the solar system that they deal with. But, like, New York gets probably the most attention as a city in the universe of The Expanse. So those are two examples that leap to mind as near future. And you had a couple on here that were kind of near future as well. American War. American War by Omar El Akkad, which was one of our favorite books of last year. In fact, we awarded it our inaugural Imaginary Award for Best Novel. So we both really loved it. And I would actually compare it to An Excess Mail by Maggie Shen King, which is also a book that was out last year in 2017. Both of those books take a changed world because of climate change, because of anthropomorphic climate change more specifically, but think about it more socially. What happens to cities that we know socially, culturally, in terms of dynamics between people, in terms of power structures between people? What happens to them in that Brave New World? And I think they both answer it in really, really different ways, in part because American War is set in the American South and Excess Mail is set in Eastern China. So, you know, very different physical settings, but the spaces that the books occupy and that they ask you to think about as you're considering what happens to these places in the very near future is similar. Very similar. But none of these are weird. Do we have any weird cities on our list?
I would say not as such. The weirdest cities that I can think of are things. They're cities.
Which are also
cities,
things.
Which are also things.
They're thingy
true.
cities.
But they rewrite the rules almost entirely. And what I'm thinking of with these is that they're projecting some of the rules. Like, an excess male in American War are thinking about what happens to the cities socially. New York 2040, The Expanse are thinking what happens to those cities maybe more logistically. Not to say that, there isn't overlap, because of course there is. But those are, kind of projecting cities that exist. Examples like his Dark Materials, where we have the Oxford, an alternate Oxford, that's taking a city that we know and tweaking it slightly. In the same way that another couple of examples, Breath of Earth by Beth Cato does that for San Francisco, thinks about what San Francisco would look like with magicians or wizards. I forget exactly what the term for them is in the book, but they can control or they have influence over the earth, so they're helping to keep San Francisco stable, helping it to, keep from rocking when the fault line shifts.
Yeah.
Or Zoo City by Lauren Bukes, or I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name right, which does the same thing, but for Johannesburg in South Africa. All three of those books are excellent examples of taking a known quantity and tweaking it slightly, and then thinking about what happens with that slight change.
Which The Power also does, another one of our top novels of last year. The Power also deals with an alternate version of cities that we know. I mean, The Power is less based in one city than some of these other texts, so it's a little bit less of like an example of the city in science fiction or fantasy, but it pairs very nicely with American War, and I'm assuming An Excess Male, although I didn't get to read An Excess Male yet, in terms of like these near future gritty, but somewhat like more social experiments with the city in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I was kind of leading earlier.
Yes.
There's one city on your like total list of cities for all of the different categories that really leaps out at me, because I think it's the only truly weird city on this list. And that's China Mieville in general. You mentioned Perdido Street Station, which I haven't read, but Embassy Town also makes for an excellent example of a weird city. Embassy Town is the China Mieville that I've gotten through so far. Why is Mieville on this total list, and like what category does it belong to?
That is an excellent question. And I put, so if you were able to see our show notes, you would see that I just wrote China Mieville in general, that I noted Perdido Street Station. I didn't have Embassy Town on here, but I should have added it. And I noted The City and the City, which is a third book by China Mieville. For whatever reason, China Mieville seems to have this fascination with cities and how they can be rendered, how they can be dismembered, how they can be put together again. So, Perdido Street Station, as an example of what he does, not that it is emblematic of everything that he does, because Embassy Town and the city are very different again. But Perdido Street Station essentially takes this idea of what cities are, why they function, the way that they can be, and sort of turns it on its head and says, okay, well, what if we kept the social inequality? What if we kept some of the more noir-ish aspects of how cities function, kind of like, the dark bars and the questions that can be asked behind veils of cigarette smoke and whatever their fantastic qualities might be. And what if we kept some of those, but also put the city within the giant skeleton of a creature? And what if we rewrote how people actually move around in that city of the giant skeleton creature? And what if we did this? And what if we did that? And so it really helps to break open this idea of what the city is and what the city can be, by keeping just enough so that we can recognize that the space in which we're operating is a city, and yet tweaking what we know of that in different ways. And certainly this goes farther. I use the word tweaking with, like, His Dark Materials and Breath of Earth, etc., but this really moves the city in completely different directions and says, okay, you think you know these things about it, and some of them you do know, and some of them, if you take them for granted, I'm going to use that to knock you the fuck over. So
Embassy Town would be a great example of, like, everything goes except for the power structures which govern the city. Mm-hmm. Like, so that's all that's left at the end, and even then that gets taken away as well. But that's kind of like the last bastion of what makes a city is the power structures. And you did mention power structures in relation to this grouping of texts in which Chinese Mieville finds himself on our list.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm really curious, do you think that Mieville's central concern is power dynamics, or do you think that there's something else at work there, just like a playfulness, he wants to turn things on their head, or...
I would say no to the power dynamics, honestly. I would say, if you wanted to look towards an example of a series of books that rewrites the way that the city functions, specifically in terms of reconsidering power dynamics, look at the Terra Ignota series by Ada Palmer, because that really takes, all of the really monolithic, giant ideas that underlie cities and the social structures that occupy them, that create them, really, essentially, and says, okay, well, what if we didn't have those? What if we didn't have capitalism? What if we didn't have, kind of like this bizarre mix of what we have right now, dictator democracy or whatever, and what if we turned all of that on its head? Mm-hmm. And Terra Ignota can be really difficult to get into. I had a really hard time reading the first book when I first encountered it, just because so much is rewritten, so much needs to be not taken for granted, that it can be hard to recognize those new spaces as cousins of the cities that we know well. Mm-hmm. And China Mieville, by contrast, changes enough, but it never really takes on the idea of the city or what the city is, or the power structures that create the city themselves.
Interesting. And interestingly, too, a lot of the cities on our list are geographically, three-dimensionally different from cities in the real world. And I think Mieville has, with his creature city, inhabiting the corpse of a creature, I think that may have, take the cake. It may take the cake for, the weirdest three-dimensional reimagining of the city. But there's also... cities which give me vertigo, in a sense. And you put Crossroads of Canopy on here on the list, and I was thinking, when I think of Crossroads of Canopy and what it's doing to the city, I also think of Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time series, and the spider cities that develop in that book, and how they are cities, but they're inhabited by creatures which are maybe like us or maybe nothing like us. And they travel differently through the cities, and the landscape of the city is fundamentally different. So what makes a city in this weird three-dimensional environment? Terra Ignota is another great example, because the texture of the planet itself is just so different from how we imagine cities today. I think that they all make for an interesting conversation together, and I was wondering if you had any speculations there. Yeah,
totally. And I think that that's a really interesting... I think that Crossroads of Canopy, which is a book that came out last year by Thoraya Dyer, and Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, are a really interesting pair that fit together in a way that I hadn't even thought of before you mentioned them. But they really are kind of thinking about the spatial layout of the city, the way that we kind of think about this way of experiencing space, where we can kind of go forwards, backwards, left and right in the city. And then if we get into a skyscraper, we can go up and down, but only, when there's an elevator or where there's a staircase. And what both Crossroads of Canopy and Children of Time do is they throw that out the window. They say, okay, well, what if, in both cases, what if the city is itself based in something that didn't start with the horizontal, that didn't start with the flat ground? Right. And granted, not all cities have to be flat. I mean, I'm thinking of San Francisco, where I'm going to go next week, and certainly San Francisco is not flat. But you know what I mean? It's different if you're actually incorporating trees that are very large, that, you have different places where you can live all up and down them. And in that way, like, you know, I'm going to bring it back to Lord of the Rings, even thinking about the elves in Lothlorien, like, that is a three-dimensional city to some degree. Like, they live up, they live down, they live right, they live left, they live forward, they live back. Like, there's lots of spatial ability, spatial movement.
Although it's not really played up in the books so much.
Not really. And it's really, you know, seeing it on screen that adds that extra layer. Like, as far as we know in the books, they don't necessarily have that going on. But, you know, that kind of, like, living in the trees, existing in the trees, is something that is in fantasies quite a lot, but that books like Crossroads of Canopy and Children of Time explore in new ways and kind of expand our idea of what a city can be, either because it is filled with gods and connected and, you know, lots of mobilities, like in Crossroads of Canopy, or it's populated by spiders, like in Children of Time.
Which, by the way, it's excellent. Oh, it's so good. And the verticality of cities, I think a nice comparison that you might make is between Children of Time and Crossroads of Canopy, where the connections are really, like, manifold and all directions, diagonal and sideways and up and down. Compare that to something like Hugh Howey's Wool, in which the cities exist in silos that are layered, and you go up and down like a single staircase to get from level to level. And then also Senlin Ascends, and that series by Josiah Bancroft. The idea of a city that's vertical, that you ascend through, that creates a very easy and archetypal, well, I say easy, but I mean, you know, it's a straightforward, I should say, an archetypal journey of discovery, coming of age, hero's journey kind of archetype, where usually you have one character set loose in that vertical city, and they ascend or descend through the various levels until they reach some end. And these can be very good books. In fact, I personally am a huge fan of the affect of Senlin Ascends. I think Josiah Bancroft has some really great sentences. But it operates very differently from these, like, all over the place sort of neural pathway kind of connections of Children of Time and Crossroads of Canopy, which are more organic in their connections between the various levels and how people or creatures travel from place to place. So I think that's an interesting comparison as well. Like, often the vertical cities are very, like, man-built and, you know, artificial environments, and the other kinds of cities are more organic. Maybe were developed by a creature that was not human, or were created by non-sentient life like trees. Although non-sentient life like trees makes, I mean, now that I've read the Over story, that's always going to be a different, my brain has broken on trees, so. Yeah.
Although, speaking of what you just said, I think Children of Time is a really interesting example in another way, because you get to chart over the generations how cities develop in Children of Time. And one thing that science fiction and fantasy can do really well is actually look at the life of a city. Like, a city is not fixed in time or in space. We can actually look at how they come to be and how they end and what happens afterwards. And I think that in both those categories, there are lots of good works in science fiction and fantasy that actually consider how does the city emerge and how does the city die.
Right.
So
and you've talked about I mean, there's so many of our favorites on this list, right? I mean, you love, especially, even more than me, I think you love the Dark Eden series by Chris Beckett. Is it called the Dark Eden series? I forget what.
I am actually not sure. I put
the
that
Eden
down,
series,
but,
Mother of Eden, Daughter of Eden, Dark Eden. That series, that trilogy, charts the development of really, like, larger civilization, not just like one specific city, but larger civilization on a rogue planet. You have another one of my favorites on here, a recent favorite, which I need to review for our website, called Semiosis by Sue Burke. Phenomenal sort of intergenerational saga of the development of a city, and the city as a collection of people who have a relationship to the built and natural environment around them.
Yes.
You also had a couple others on here, which you probably can speak far more eloquently than I can on, including Octavia Butler.
Yes, Octavia Butler, who we love to death. Obviously, we have an entire podcast devoted to her, but I would count several of her books in this particular place. However, I think that the books where her finest city building, I almost said world building, but specifically city building, in that the characters themselves are interested in creating a community and all the social structures that underlie that community, is the duology Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents.
Which is just a flat-out awesome series to begin with.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too. You had this paired with Venus of Dreams, which I'm familiar with, and Ecotopia, which I haven't read. I don't know the time period of Ecotopia, but Venus of Dreams and Parables, the Parables, they were written 70s, 80s?
Yeah, I think 80s, and Ecotopia was of that time as well.
And you compare and contrast the 80s envisionings of cities with the Dark Eden and Semiosis envisionings of cities. And I think that there's maybe some rich comparisons to be made there, too.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's a lot of hope in what's going into Venus of Dreams by Pamela Sargent, Ecotopia by Ernest Callenbach. It's maybe going to seem strange if I say there's a lot of hope in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents if you're familiar with Octavia Butler's work. But the way that my boyfriend likes to describe Octavia Butler is that she tended to be very pessimistic in the short term, but very optimistic in the long term. And I think that is very much on display in the two Parable books, because you have ultimately the creation of, and granted it's not so focused on the city or even the civilization, but rather on the culture and the religion. But the development of community, the way you actually get people, to form the germ of a city, and then what comes after that, is so at the forefront of the two Parable books, as well as the other books as well. And they really think about, how do people positively do this? How do hopeful people positively do this? And I put those adverbs in very specifically to say that kind of the foundational social assumption of a lot of the books that were coming out around that time was that you could have groups of people who shared similar purposes, who were oriented towards a better future, and that then, certainly not without conflict, which is very, very clear in the Parable books, in Venus of Dreams, not so much in Ecotopia, but still present. But you could still form something out of that, and it would be a good thing because it was brought together in this, hopeful vision, and that would endure. And you can see that even in, I think, The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, and The Settling of Inaris is a good example of this as well, although, again, that is not about a specific city, but is kind of about, the distributed spaces that a city would occupy. On the other hand, all of that said, Dark Eden and that trilogy has a very different approach to how cities form, and the immediate inequities that come along with cities, that Chris Beckett kind of hypothesizes as maybe endemic to the way that people treat each other, or this particular group, maybe it's their deal and not all people. Semiosis is similar in that you start with this very hopeful, this very, almost 80s, and I hate to say the entire 80s was like that, but this very utopian view of what the city, what this new community could look like. And by the second chapter, you have murder.
Yeah.
And so these things fall apart quickly, but they don't fall apart without reason. And
right.
That's important. And that's more, I think, of a modern twist to things. You're going to find a lot of that. How does the dream, how does the hope fall apart and yet endure in these same books? And again, I don't want to give Pamela
right.
Sargent, I don't want to give Octavia Butler the short shrift here to say that they didn't think about those same things. But where we get in the end is something that I think has shifted a little bit.
Well, and I think, so Dark Eden and Semiosis provide an interesting pivot point to another contrast. perhaps we've grown more pessimistic in general. I mean, Semiosis and Dark Eden, it's like things go to shit, but still, like, there's more, and there's sort of a general upward trend in the evolution of those civilizations and cities. Whereas a lot of modern science fiction and fantasy, but especially the science fictional cities, they seem to be pretty pessimistic in their long-term outlook. And I'm thinking you listed the Tierling series, the 5th season trilogy, Hot House, Station 11. I had Station 11 on my list. I would also add Born by Jeff Vandermeer. The idea of cities as places that do fall apart, as places where life happens after the city falls apart. Maybe even the most worthwhile life happens after the city or during the falling apart. I think you could even include Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake series to this, like the devolution of the city and organized life. To our general list here, but like, do you think that we're more pessimistic, or do we just are we specifically as two individuals reading pessimistic current modern science fiction?
I think that there's definitely a pessimistic trend there. Hot House is a bit of an exception on that list. It is a novel by Brian Aldiss, which came out decades ago. I want to say in the 60s, but it might have even been the 50s. And yet, like, it shares some similarities with other books in this particular segment of the podcast, in that nearly all of them suggest that the breakdown of the city is also accompanied by a breakdown of civilization, falling apart of social norms,
natural life.
And not necessarily. I would say in Hot House for sure. But, well, no, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that either. Just, it's on display in some books more than others. I think that, like, Station 11 maybe doesn't look at it so directly. The Tierling also doesn't think about it so directly. But that is something that occurs, but also doesn't have to be, you know, it's not like they're giant scales that are weighed in balance and, like, one tips down so the other tips up. But, like, I think it is interesting that a lot of these books do pose that the city is essentially a stand-in for civilization and culture. And when you lose that, you lose civilization and culture. And so when we're looking at things, even like Dark Eden, like Semiosis, you see on the other side of that, when the city is forming, when the community is forming, then that means greater ability to, you know, to espouse those cultural norms, to that's totally the wrong word, to like create new cultural norms, to be human, to understand what it means to be human. So on the, you know, buried down there in the footnote is kind of this supposition that to live in the city is to be human. That are, you know, maybe it's not so much based on the place of the city, but the space of the city, which means that we're close to other people, we have relationships with other people, we are social creatures, and that is represented by the city. And when those bonds break down, when those relationships break down, when the city is no more, then we lose something integral about what it means to be human.
And I think that you could even add to, like, the expanded universe of texts which examine that question, stuff like Lord of the Flies and Lost, the television show. Once you remove people from the city, is that the same as the city falling apart?
Right.
And I think both of those texts might say yes, and they also seem to both espouse this idea that when you take people out of the city, you also take civilization out of the people.
Yes, exactly. Totally.
And, I think it's interesting, too, like, all of these cities that we've looked at have been stationary cities. There have been some recent experiments in mobile cities. The Warrior Within by Angus MacIntyre has some traveling cities. There's that book which was adapted for television movie, something which is coming out soon. I keep forgetting what it's called, but it has a very dramatic trailer in which cities move. There were also moving cities in the John Carter movie adaptation. I think that we could probably dig into a lot more about cities than we have here today. But there's a lot of, like, cities. There's a lot of cities.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to do cities. There's a lot of what, you know, seems like kind of, or can be a fixed background, a fixed setting for whatever, you know, a particular piece of work might be, actually can turn into something really dynamic and interesting when you start to question its suppositions, and when those works really dig into what is the city, how is this treating the city, what does the city mean.
So I think perhaps we should, at some point in the future, compare and contrast with a whole episode dedicated to road trips in science fiction and
interesting.
fantasy.
Yep.
I think that would make for a great contrast if we're going to talk about dynamic movement as like the central tenet of science fiction, as compared to like the stationary as a central tenet of science fiction. I think we could talk about road trips.
Yeah, for sure.
So
agreed.
I guess look forward to that in the future when we get ourselves organized.
Absolutely. So, do you want to let our listeners know where they can find us?
Oh, absolutely. Please, first of all, find us on Twitter. Our handle is imaginary_pod, and we do reply and we do listen. And we would love to hear from you there. You can also find us, most especially and particularly on our website, imaginaries.net. And our website includes a lot of original content by now, which will hopefully be useful and entertaining to you, including, of course, information on our Imaginary Award winners from 2017, as well as book reviews and other thoughts of interest on our website. So go there if you're looking for maybe wider conversations or bits and pieces which didn't fit into our podcasts. Very, very fun to put together, so please make use of that. You can also listen to us wherever you are listening to us, as well as on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. We try to keep all of those places up to date. So find us there. If you can pop on iTunes and give us a review, that helps others find us, which would be most useful. Have I forgotten anything, Tony?
I don't believe so. I believe that covers everything.
Yay! That is the first and only time in my life where I will have done something so comprehensive. So thank you for listening to us today. We hope you enjoyed our podcast. And I guess bon voyage until next time. That was a terrible goodbye, but goodbye.
Until next time. Bye.
Bye.